Today is our second Sunday in the season of Advent as we lead up towards Christmas Day. We talked about last week how Advent is a unique season in a secular world or a secular-ish world. And the reason it's unique is because often we skip directly to Christmas. But the spirit of Advent is a spirit of waiting. It's a spirit of anticipation, of preparing ourselves for what God did and is going to do through the person of Jesus. And I want to focus this week on the idea of peace. Peace. But I want to start by telling the story of Christmas Eve 1914. This may not be something that's familiar to you, but within a few months of World War I, both sides had entrenched themselves. They had started into trench warfare and dug their holes, and they were hanging out in it. And then Christmas Eve, something crazy happened. All of a sudden, on one side, they started to hear Christmas carols being sung. Oh, Holy Night over here. And then on the German side, I'm assuming, since it's the only German one I know, maybe Oh Christmas Tree, Oh Tannenbaum. And they started to hear these carols coming from each one of the trenches. And then following the carols, all of a sudden you had men shouting, Merry Christmas, Happy Christmas. And then, can you imagine this? One of the most brutal wars in the history of our world. Can you imagine being the first one, caught up in the spirit of Christmas, to step out of your trench and wander into no man's land? But that's exactly what happened. We see these pictures. They came together. They met in the middle. They shared information. Hi, I'm Jay. I'm from this side. Hi, I'm Jim. I'm from this side. Something in that moment shifted enemies into brothers. Now, it didn't last. The powers that be in the moment made sure that they didn't replicate this the next year, because it makes war awfully difficult when you see a commonality between the sides that have been pitted against one another. But for one night, Christmas Eve into Christmas Day in 1914, something changed. Even soldiers on one side or the other would help the other bury their dead. They played football or soccer in the middle of no man's land. For one day, in the midst of this brutal conflict, peace was the way the world was defined. And I think about that story a lot when it comes to the Christmas season. I think about that story a lot when it comes to what we talk about today, about what peace is. Before I go any further, I would love to stop and pause and talk through peace by the story of Isaiah leading to Jesus. This is from chapter 9, verse 6 through just 6 and 7. For to us a child is born, a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So we're going to talk today about peace. What does it mean that Jesus is the Prince of Peace? I think the best way to move forward in our conversation on peace is to get a broader biblical understanding of peace. This word that's on the screen here is the word shalom, which is the Hebrew word that is used for peace. In this passage from Isaiah chapter 9, Isaiah says that Jesus is the Prince of Shalom. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but this is a word that I have studied and looked at and often tried to understand more fully in my own mind. And the reason is because you could make the argument that shalom, peace, is one of the most important words in the entire biblical narrative. Shalom. But what I want us to do is to broaden our understanding of what biblical peace means. You see, peace is often equated to this. Anybody remember this? I feel like I used to do this more than I do now, right? Peace. If you're a child of the 60s or you're familiar with the 60s, this was a big deal in the 60s. Peace, peace. I remember that only from Forrest Gump. I am not a child of the 60s. I was born in the 80s, which I don't know what we did, but this wasn't much of it. But our understanding of peace is often simply the absence of conflict, which is an aspect of peace. But I think that the absence of conflict doesn't fully capture the idea of shalom. Because shalom is not simply the absence of conflict. Shalom is about wholeness. It's about wholeness. It's about human flourishing. So when you think of peace, when we think of the peace of the Advent season, when we think of Jesus being the Prince of Peace, let's move beyond the idea that Jesus came to make it to where we didn't fight anymore, and instead recognize that when Jesus came as the Prince of Peace, he came to bring wholeness here and now. Wholeness and human flourishing. We love good stories about broken things being made whole, right? Let me give you an example. This right here is a guy named Alex Smith. Alex Smith is a quarterback for the Washington football team. 2 years ago on the field, he broke his leg. Gruesome break. I did not play that video for you. You are welcome. Gruesome break, so bad so that they thought at best case scenario they were going to have to amputate his leg. But there was also a likelihood that Alex, because of what was going on with the infection and the blood loss and all of the different things, that there was a possibility that Alex could lose his actual life. Like I said, we love stories where broken things are made whole. And here's the moment where Alex had the chance to make his first throw in over 2 years. And what you see right here is the joy and excitement of his family seeing what was once broken being made whole. We love those stories. Why? Because I think inherent in who we are as human beings, as created in the image of God, we resonate with the idea of wholeness because we know the experience of the lack thereof. We know what it means to have broken aspects or parts of us that aren't completely whole, and we want and long for that. So what does it mean to worship the Prince of Peace? I want to frame this in 3 specific ways. I want to frame what it means that we are the children or the worshipers of the Prince of Peace in 3 ways. The first way, and this is a simple one, is that Jesus came to bring shalom, peace, wholeness, flourishing to creation, to the creation. That Jesus came in the flesh to give us a glimpse of what things look like fully renewed. Now, how do I know that? There's 2 passages I pull that from. Number 1 is Romans 8. We recognize that in Romans 8 that Paul is writing that creation is also groaning for shalom to come back. And then, if we go to the story of Jesus, told in all of the synoptic gospels, as the storms rage on the Sea of Galilee, right? We are understanding what raging seas feels like. The storm is raging on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples are panicked. They go down below the boat where Jesus is sleeping. Jesus comes up, and what does he bring to the waters? Peace, shalom. Even the seas and the winds, they obey him. So Jesus came to bring shalom, to bring peace, to bring wholeness to creation. But the area where I really want to focus us in today is on the relational side of Jesus' shalom. Now, I have a picture, and it's too dark, and I didn't change it between the services, so it was not going to look great on the screen. But maybe if you're here on campus, you can tell the people who are online who this person is. Now, here's the guess. I just want to know what movie this guy is from, so let's start with that one. Home Alone. If you can't see it online, this is Old Man Marley. Old Man Marley was the next-door neighbor of a Kevin McAllister, who is the primary character in Home Alone. If you're unfamiliar with that movie, it's on Disney+. It's worth the subscription for 1 month just to watch Home Alone. It's maybe my top 2 or 3 Christmas movies, and my son loves it. If you have kids or grandkids, it's the best. Old Man Marley, you say no? All right, man, I got you. That's fine. Old Man Marley is the next-door neighbor of Kevin McAllister. There's a story about Old Man Marley, a made-up myth about his life, that he was hiding secrets in his basement, that he was this evil man. But that's not the reality of the story. You see, in all of our Christmas stories, when they're done really well, we see stories of broken relationships being made whole. And the same thing happens here at home. alone. It's one of the things that happens is at the end of the story, old man Marley and Kevin meet at church on Christmas Eve. And they start to have a conversation, and Kevin, little 8-year-old kid, figures out that the reason that he is a little more grizzled is because he is in relational disconnection with his son and his grandkids. And so Kevin McAllister, in all of his wisdom, says, you should go and make up with them this Christmas. And at the very end of the story, we get to see a glimpse of old man Marley meeting his son and grandkids for Christmas morning. Maybe that reference falls apart for you. Maybe this one is a little more your speed. Anybody want to tell me what movie this is from? It's A Wonderful Life. This guy's name is George Bailey. George Bailey, once again, a great Christmas story, is about the broken experience being made whole or being made right. George Bailey is on the verge of taking his own life because everything is falling apart. His whole world is fractured. A guardian angel comes and tells him what life would be like without him in it. And something changes in him, and he wants to live. And he comes back and he begins to make right what was wrong. Okay, maybe that one doesn't resonate. Maybe this guy resonates with you. That's Buddy the Elf. Buddy the Elf is the story of a relationship being made whole. There's a documentary on Netflix called The Holiday Movies That Make Us, and in one of those movies, or one of those documentary episodes, they do a whole thing on the Elf movie. And what you find out is the guy who wrote the screenplay for Elf lost his father at an early age. And so central to the story as he created this incredible movie is the story of a son and a dad being reconciled. It's a powerful story. So much so that there's a guy named Doug Henning. You don't know Doug Henning, but this is Doug Henning right here. Doug Henning is 43 years old and got through Ancestry.com. He knew he was adopted his entire life. He was on Ancestry.com and did that thing where you can tell who your DNA is. He found a couple biological cousins that he'd never met before, started making connections with the cousins. The next thing you know, he found out this is where my dad is and this is who my actual biological dad is. So he made a phone call. They got on a Zoom call for the first time and he got to meet his dad via Zoom. And they made the decision that he would fly out to Boston for Thanksgiving. Well, Doug thought it would be funny to dress like Buddy the Elf and showed up at the airport as his dad got off the plane for the first time that they physically met one another. Doug had made the choice to dress up like Buddy the Elf, which he said was a little awkward because his dad says, I have no idea what you're talking about. But it's a true story about relationships that are hurting, struggling, absent, being made whole, or being found as part of the holiday season. And what I want you to hear today is that the Prince of Peace, the Prince of Shalom, that we see in the person of Jesus, that we celebrate as part of this Advent season, means that you in your life need to be working towards relational shalom. You need to be working in your experience because we don't simply hear the story of Jesus and say, well, that's a cool, quaint story. Let me put it in a box, put it up on the tree. That'll be the end of it. What we do is we hear the story of Jesus. We understand more who Jesus is. And in response, we live more into who Jesus is calling us to be. And so the first thing I want you to say is that Jesus, the Prince of Peace, came to bring relational peace to your life. That brother and sisters would be reunited again, that we would experience the joy of that moment where no man's land was filled with soccer and laughter and Christmas songs. That conflict on which side of this or what side you are of this isn't what defines us within one another. 1 John is an incredible book. In the last 2 chapters, John spends a ton of time talking about love. And he emphasizes it in a few different ways. Number one is that he says God is love. God is love. If you know God, you know love. If you know love, you know God. But the second thing he does, and I hit on, especially in this season of life, is that God expects you as his people to be loving. To be loving, and this isn't some like altruistic, like love your neighbor. That's important. That's essential. That's one of the great commandments. But what John is helping us understand about God is he says, as Christians, as people who follow Jesus, we shouldn't disagree and hate one another in the church. We should be people of love. We should err on the side of grace when it comes to one another. We shouldn't just forgive somebody once or twice, but 70 times 7. That we, as a church, as the people of God, should lead from the example of abundant love. Love looks at a relationship in conflict and says, I don't care who was wronged, I'm going to work to restore it. And I know sitting in this room, there's people who have had incredible injustice done against them. Relationships, families, friends that you haven't talked to in years. And I'm not saying that you have to be best friends again, but if we're to believe that the Prince of Peace has come to make a difference in our lives, then what we need to be doing is how do we work for peace in all of our relationships? In all of our relationships. One of the weirdest fruits of this season over the last 9 months, looks like it'll be the next 3 months, is how much the idiom of absence makes the heart grow fonder has been proven to be an absolute lie, right? Like absence doesn't make the heart grow fonder. I know that I could look around in this room, and for those of you that are online, that know that relationships have changed over the last 9 months. Relationships have changed. Friendships that used to be really tight are no longer that way because you're not seeing one another regularly. Because there are disagreements on how this person's doing that or this person's doing this or we shouldn't do this, whatever. I understand the tension of relational conflict, and I'm not trying to belittle that. But as followers of Jesus, we need to take the steps to do what we can to live in the spirit and heart of the Prince of Peace and work to reconcile relationships, to fix what we can that is broken. And Paul even expands that. He says it's not just within Christian brother and Christian brother. This is for everybody. And we already know that because we know the story of Jesus and the call to love neighbors. But this is what Paul says in Romans 12. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Live in shalom with everyone. So the first side of that is that Jesus, the Prince of Peace, came to restore shalom in our human relationships. But what transcends all of that is what we remember in the Advent story is that the Prince of Peace, the baby in the manger, that we know the story of who Jesus is and becomes, comes to bring peace, wholeness, flourishing in our relationship between us and God. Between us and God, there's a chasm that was created by the fact that we as mankind, as humanity, has constantly fallen short of the expectation. And God is not overwhelmingly angry with us, but because He loves us, He steps in the flesh to be with us. Colossians 1 is a beautiful passage. It's a church hymn. Most people say it's an early church hymn that Paul took and rewrote into his letter to the church in Colossae. And there's this point where he tells the church who Jesus is, the image of the invisible God. And then he says that Jesus is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything Jesus might have supremacy. And then it says this, in Him, in Jesus, the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And then through Him, and through Jesus, it pleased God to reconcile to Himself all things, whether in heaven or on earth, by making shalom by the blood of the cross. It pleased God to make peace between you and I and Him. He wasn't angry until He came down. Like, what a wild way. If God was angry, He could have just smote all of us. But because He loves us, He was pleased to make peace through the blood of the cross. So the transcendent aspect of God's peaceful nature in the person of Jesus is that Jesus came. This, what was broken between us and God, which is on us, has made whole by our relationship with Jesus. The Prince of Peace came to make what was fractured whole in our relationships with one another and our relationship between him and us. That's all Jesus was about, so that we might be partakers in the shalom of God, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding.